So I left for a 3-month European book tour at the end of August last year. And my initial plan was to it was a 90-day tour, and I was hoping just to stay traveling as long as I could to kind of kickstart a sabbatical post this project. Just was really in a position where I didn't know what my next project would be, didn't know where I belonged, didn't have that sense of belonging. I guess that's in Ginseng Roots. You can read between the lines. And so I for at least the last 5 years, I've been fantasizing of a sabbatical to kind of explore the world and sort of reclaim my sense of self and creativity, kind of get over this midlife career slump.
It's funny that you say that as though you weren't traveling the world to actually produce this book. I mean, you ended up in, it seems like China a couple times, in Korea. I mean, you definitely, world travel is definitely a product of what you do for a living.
I suppose I've been a nomad for eight years now. And I moved 12 different times while working on Ginseng Roots. So yeah, I haven't been in a fixed location. The book is coming out in April as a graphic novel, but it was serialized first as a comic book series, 12 issues through Uncivilized Books. And essentially, I lived in a different city or studio or home for each one of those issues. So I guess this has been an ongoing phase. Now I'm just getting more serious about it, where I'm like, no, I'm just going to live out of a suitcase until I feel that sense of this is where I'm supposed to be.
When you say sabbatical, what do you mean by that specifically?
Well, another theme with this book is it was really born out of a midlife crisis, certainly creatively, and kind of losing my sense of direction and passion for comics and graphic novels. After doing this for 25 years professionally, it became a job like any other, and a job that I really was doubting myself in. And I really just think I've spent my whole life working. I started working full-time in my summers when I was 10 years old. I never really went to college. I never had time off. I just feel burned out. And so I envy academics who have a built-in sabbatical into their career. I don't know, is that every 10 years or something, or 8 years? I wanted one of those. And I wasn't going to be lazy. It wasn't just to lounge on a beach. It was to, explore things creatively.
From the outside, you seem to have this tremendous work ethic. And obviously, based on this book, that was instilled in you in a very, very early age.
I think I got to swing back and forth. When I'm working very ambitiously. But then I go through really long spells of creative block, essentially. A year or 2 years at a time that I'm not really producing.
I think maybe, I can't remember, but it might have been working on Habibi. But you mentioned that in the book about, the amount of time it took to get off the ground. And I guess to a certain extent, how your idea of work had evolved. Is there a big difference between this idea of really being intentional about taking time off and then those periods where you would have liked to have been writing, but just couldn't?
Well, with David Lynch dying a month ago or so, I was re-listening to one of his Fresh Air interviews, and I was reassured to hear that he goes through a similar process. I think of him as very prolific and unfettered. It doesn't seem like a person who doubts what he does. He just lets even his subconscious guide him. But in that interview, he was revealing that, in fact, he does go through these long periods between, his catching the big fish or whatever periods where he's just waiting for the idea to come. And he does get a lot of anxiety when nothing's biting, nothing's nibbling. I don't know. And I guess generally what happens is when you finish a book, you're required to do promotional stuff for a year. Maybe not all cartoonists, but authors, and I'm lucky to be one of those cartoonists that kind of has sort of a prose author sort of lifestyle. And so a book comes out and you tour for a year. That's your job. Um, and whatever future projects you have, you can kind of fiddle with them on the back burner, but they don't get your attention for a while. And usually there's a moment about a year into touring where I'm like, I've had my fill of touring. It feels really unproductive. And I'm like, I just got to get myself somewhere stable again to start something new.
In your last book in particular, I mean, it seems like that is the response to it, or perhaps the lack of response to it, is a lot of what spurred on this crisis and the work that you're doing on this book. Is that fair to say?
That is fair to say. That my last book came out 10 years ago, Space
Mm.
Dumplings. It's this like sci-fi comedy, aimed at younger readers for Scholastic. And that was also born out of its own like creative crisis, because I did Habibi in 2011, which was a very epic and serious project. And that got both positive and negative critical attention. And I felt really worn down by that, where I'm like, oh, I want to just reclaim something playful and fun in my work again. I was motivated by wanting to give back to my 10-year-old self that fell in love with comics. Because when you hit your 40s, you start to question, like, why did this medium imprint on me? It's definitely attached to childhood trauma and nostalgia. So with Space Dumplings, I was really trying to find that sense of joy and humor and playfulness that comics represented for me as a kid. I'd spent so much of my career trying to create quote unquote serious, adult graphic novels. And I thought Space Dumplings would be a more accessible work for a wider audience, especially after Habibi, which was very divisive for people. Like, well, let me do something that's fun, and who can judge that? But that was really the biggest failure, at least financially, of my career. And so then I was really left reeling of like, wow, I just worked on something for 4 years and essentially never got paid because I gave my book advance to the colorist, the amazing Dave Stewart. It's the only book I've done that's color. But that sort of ruined me financially. And then I went through this whole new phase of doubt and like, well, what can I do? I'm not really earning a living making new books. I essentially just get some what do you call it, passive income from blankets, which is a book I did 20 years ago, which has had success, but it's not enough to propel me to the future.
But it was clear, in spite of a lack of response, that you were going to, at some point in the future, throw yourself into another project.
No, it was not clear. I was in Los Angeles at the time, and I was taking a lot of meetings. I really thought I could sell Space Dumplings, in Hollywood. Because there'd always been interest from Hollywood with every book I did. But in the past, I really wasn't interested in talking with them. I didn't see how my books would translate to film or television. And I sort of had this feeling at that time that comics were more pure, graphic novels were more pure, and I just wanted to focus on that world of storytelling and not let it get diluted by the entertainment industry. But when I did Space Dumplings, I was living in Los Angeles, and I was just like, well, maybe I can make a career jump. Maybe I could be a co-runner, like showrunner on a animated series or something like that. I had so many friends in animation, and from the outside looking in, it looked like they were having a lot more fun and definitely getting financially compensated better. So I put a lot of my time and energy while living in Los Angeles towards taking meetings and trying to pitch projects and potentially leave comics for the more lucrative world of animation.
That doesn't really make it into this book, no.
There's a 2-page sequence where I show one of my Hollywood meetings. I won't reveal which studio or which lot I was on, but otherwise that's a pretty accurate representation of the meeting. And this was happening all the time. I'd go in for a Space Dumplings meeting, and in fact, the people uh, weren't interested in space dumplings. They were just curious what other things I was working on to see if there was some intellectual property they could develop.
It's coming back to me now that that the person on the other side of the table was brought their own ideas to the meeting.
Yes, so I started describing Ginseng Roots to him, which was a project I was starting to develop, and he wasn't that interested until I mentioned the fact that I had a personal connection to ginseng, that I'd spent 10 years of my childhood working in this agriculture. But then he wanted to put a little Hollywood spin on the idea and said, well, what if we develop it, in a more fantastical way where China is trying to obtain all of the ginseng grown in the US? And this is 2016. His first idea was because they want to create some sort of super virus.
We're early first Trump term, and
no, it was pre-Trump. This was early 2016. And actually, now that you mentioned Trump, when Trump was first elected in November 2016, I started Ginseng Roots writing the project a month later. So I think there was an element of the sort of collective trauma of Trump's election propelling me to start on this project, which I thought was about the Midwest and the working class and agricultural communities, and maybe even the state of definitely the state of Wisconsin's role in Trump's election, because in 2016 it was really that those three states, I'm sorry, what's wrong with my brain? The
swing states.
Yeah, well, and specifically the Blue Wall, which was these progressive states that were in sort of working class communities, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, that traditionally always went Democrat. And they swung towards Trump in 2016. So end of 2016, like a lot of people, I was a little traumatized and confused about what was happening in our country. And I found myself going back to my home state and exploring some of those themes abstractly with this project, Ginseng Roots.
It's interesting to hear that you were surprised, and I say this partially because I was in New York City for about 20 years, and I actually just moved up. I'm in the Hudson Valley, about 2 hours north. And, a thing that I've noticed up here is that you drive down a country road for, 5 minutes, and then the Trump flags start to appear. So certainly you knew these people, you knew, and you grew up with religion. So, to a certain extent, you do know how and why they tick. So it's interesting to hear that you were surprised that things swung that way.
Yeah, you're right. And in fact, terribly, I was less surprised on this second round. But I was stuck in my sort of West Coast bubble on the first round. I'd been living in Los Angeles for a couple of years, and I'd lived in Portland, Oregon, maybe the most progressive city in the US, for 25 years before that. So yeah, like you, I was aware of the interior of the country and smaller communities. But I was surprised. And what happened is all of my friends in Los Angeles kind of pointed fingers at me. They wanted me to explain what was going on because they knew I was from mostly white, rural farming communities that helped put this man in power. So they wanted me to be the one to explain why people were going that direction.
This is a cliche to say, but probably a cliche for a reason, that you travel and it sort of opens up your world to new cultures and and perhaps that makes you more accepting of different people around the world. But in the fact that it was this farming community that was growing ginseng, and I guess commercially had this connection to China. There really wasn't a connection at all, though, right? I mean, it seems like in spite of that, to a certain extent, they could have just been growing anything.
Yeah, exactly. As a child, I never thought about ginseng. It was just a job. And I think for most farmers, it's just a crop that happened to be lucrative. It could have, there's a lot of soybeans being grown there. Aren't a lot of farmers eating tofu in their diet, but it is a lucrative crop, as is corn, which usually goes into like feed and ethanol. It's not even edible human grade corn. So yeah, it's just like whatever pays the bills. And this project sort of started with a desire to write about plants, but I don't know anything about plants. I was prompted by Michael Pollan's book, Botany of Desire. I was really inspired by that book. I'm like, I want to do my own book about plants. So I was like, well, what plant do I have any knowledge or intimacy of? And then I remembered working in ginseng for a decade of my childhood. And as soon as I started dipping into the research around ginseng, it felt infinitely fascinating to me. For one thing, it's like the very beginning of the trade relationship between China and the U.S., before we were even a country. And initially, I just wanted to write about the plant in sort of a nonfiction essay sort of way. The plant was going to be the primary protagonist. But I could see, like, when I was pitching the idea to friends, they would get a little bored. Like, it didn't see, they're like, what? Ginseng? Why? And then when I would talk about the personal element of working for a decade, ages 10 to 20, in this agriculture, this tiny town I grew up in rural Wisconsin, population 1,200 people, was the largest producer of cultivated American ginseng in the world when I was a kid. And then people were like, what? That's weird. That's crazy. Let's hear about that. But yeah, going back to your question, it was the cultural identity of our town. We were the primary ginseng producer, not only in the U.S., but of American ginseng in the world. But I don't think anybody cared about the actual
consumer.
Yeah, the sort of stories, the Chinese medicine, the consumer market. Yeah, it was just something that was exported.
It strikes me, and you do, again, in the book, you talk about this kind of period where you're unsure whether this is something that you wanted to write about, and you were floating it with different people. Did it not, because you lived it, and because it was such, a part of your childhood, did it not occur to you that this was interesting, that people would find that connection interesting?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Again, as a child, I didn't think about it. It was just a job. In fact, when I started working at age 10 and we were getting $1 an hour, and the motivation was that translated into one comic book an hour. And I don't think I'd be a cartoonist if it weren't for ginseng work. But yeah, back to your question. Yeah, no, I never thought about it. It wasn't interesting. And again, it was a little bit of a hard sell at first when I was pitching the idea to people, because ginseng is even not that well known in, American Western culture. I mean, in Asia, everybody knows ginseng. Box Brown did a book about cannabis. Like, there's a crop that people have a lot of interest in. And beyond that, I mean, how many plants can you get people really excited about, or agricultural crops?
Again, prior to settling on this book, specifically, what was it about plants? What part of that story did you want to tell?
I mean, the biggest problem in the world is environmental crisis, and a part of the problem, I think, is that we look at everything through a human-centric perspective, so that has to be jostled. And I think of plants as some sort of conscious beings, so why not tell the story through the perspective of a plant? And that got diluted as I worked on the project. Like, I realized the entry point for the reader was myself as a character, because they had the sort of a relationship with blankets already, so I guess ultimately people do need a human narrator to bring them into the narrative. But yeah, I just was sick of humans at the center of every narrative, and this, what do they call it? Speciesism, I don't think we're the most important species on this planet. And I think that's part of the problem, is that we have this dominion over nature perspective.
Anthropocentric, something like that.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
it sounds like that still, like, the idea was to tell a much larger story through plants.
Exactly. Yeah. The book was motivated or inspired in part, it may sound pretentious, but by Melville's Moby Dick. I really like that kind of narrative where each chapter is its own like encyclopedic like diversion, a labyrinthian tangle of some people find that annoying about Moby Dick, but that, to me, that's the great pleasure in that book, is that you get to go off on these tangents of fascinating different elements of,
Just listing every whale.
and ginseng was the white whale for this book because it was a springboard to talk about globalization, the trade relationship between China and the US, the changing face of agriculture from family farms to these mega corporate farms, pesticides, and how the military industrial industry is linked to our agricultural and or pharmaceutical, industry. Just class divide in the US, and how that fed into the political divide. So ginseng was sort of connected to all of that.
So you're describing a 10,000 page book from the sound of it. And I know, like, I know that you have, that it's hard for you to edit, that it's almost more difficult for you to really to write a shorter book. But much like the writing of the book itself, it sounds like once you sort of sit down and get this idea, then that just keeps ballooning outwards and kind of gets out of your control to a certain extent.
Yeah, part of the problem is that I grew up in a non-literary household where the only book in the house was the Bible. So the Bible is my template for book objects. I'm always trying to make comics that have the physical heft of a Bible. But what helped me with this book is that it was serialized. I did 12 comic book issues for a Minneapolis-based publisher, Uncivilized Books. That predates this the Pantheon release that's coming out this April, and those were my first. That was the first chance I had to work in that format, because I kind of came into this career at the beginning of the graphic novel movement. Unlike a lot of the cartoonists of the 90s who first serialized their work as comic books. And I really wanted to work in that format. It was the form of comics that imprinted on me as a child. And working in just 32-page installments really forced me to be more concise in my storytelling. I didn't have the luxury of, making a scene 10 pages. I had to try to figure out how to do it in 2 pages. So I think there's a density to this book, both in the text and the images, because of that.
More concise, but again, it still ends up being quite a large book, and you still go to China, you still go to Korea. I mean, you certainly, like, you could have just filled a book specifically with life from your hometown and making it largely memoir, but it sounds like you really did want to come at this from every angle.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I get bored just talking about myself, and the book is about globalization. So I wanted to talk about it with a global view in mind and to show how this tiny town I grew up in is connected to the other side of the world. And that's sort of the world we all live in now. We don't live in a vacuum.
Was serializing a positive experience? It's something that I think it was a Comics Journal interview that you did that struck me as really interesting. Because you and I spoke, and I realized today that it was 4 years ago. So it was when, you were still relatively early, I guess, into the days of serialization. But that putting out this book the way you did, and, as floppies through Tom K, that you were able to have a book out there and then have people react to it. That maybe just the act of, like, having already started writing about this and having it accessible gave you more access, or perhaps, like, grew people's, from your town, their interest in the project that you were working on.
Yes, I was hoping that, like, potential interviewees would come out of the woodwork because of the book. And I was hoping for a constructive form of criticism, because obviously all the books are targets of criticism, but it always it just seems like kind of beside the point and not constructive if you receive it after you've worked on a project for 10 years and it's out in the world. So I was hoping to get constructive criticism in real time that I could apply to the writing of the book. If I got a detail wrong, somebody would be, there would always be in the past someone to leap up and be like, no, you got that wrong. And I was hoping for that with this book, and I was hoping that it would help interviewees materialize. And I don't think that manifested. One of the most fun parts was having like a old school pre-internet letters column. And that was fun to have in the book, especially because the book was being serialized like from the beginning of 2019 till like 2021. So there was so much happening globally in terms of, pandemic, George Floyd's murder, like January 6th, like riots, insurrection. And people were writing about that stuff in real time in the letters column. So I like how it's sort of a time capsule in that way. No, I didn't feel like any effective, really constructive criticism. I will say that the series is different from the final book. Once I finished the last issue the last issue would have came out in 2023. I sat down and read the whole series, issues 1 through 12, and I thought each issue worked on its own, self-contained, because that's the way I was sort of writing them. But there was something missing in terms of how they all connected together. It was missing a narrative arc. And so I had to kind of like break it apart again and figure out what was missing. And I added 60 or 70 new story pages to the final graphic novel. So that would have been a 14-issue series. It was necessary. It was absolutely necessary. And that's the drawback of not sitting down and writing the whole first draft out before starting the final art. I had an outline for the series, but I was only focusing on one chapter at a time.
In older books, when you're writing them in the more, I guess, traditional method, or your more traditional method of going away, working on a book and then coming back, how closely do they hew to that initial outline?
Well, in the case of both Blankets and Habibi, I never knew what the last chapter of those books would be. So otherwise, things are pretty close, one-to-one, like what my rough drawn, like thumbnail version of the book was to the final pages. But in the case of both books, I didn't know how to end them. And so getting stuck in that for a few months, I'm like, I'll just start drawing the book because I know I'll be drawing for years. And then the ending should reveal itself to me in that time. And in the case of both Blankets and Habibi, when I got to those final chapters after 2 or 3 years of drawing final art, I still didn't know how to end the book. So I had to take time off and really. So I guess it's a pattern for me. Once I get to an end, I really have to go through this violent soul searching process to find the ending.
Maybe that's a unintentional benefit of writing a really long book, is that you get to push the ending off for longer.
Yeah, and they say that's not the way to write. You're supposed to figure out the ending first and write backwards, but I've never approached it that way. And for me, I have to have the exploration, some element of exploration and sort of risk, climbing without a rope or whatever, without a net. And because after you've drawn 400 final pages, you have no choice but to figure out the ending. You can't back out at that point. You really have painted yourself into a corner.
Do you feel that your difficulty writing endings is perhaps like similar or parallels your difficulty in editing yourself? In that an ending is like, obviously this story could continue on forever if you want it to. So it's really important to leave people in a good place.
Yes. I thought you were going to say, does it correlate to the fact that I'm a nomad and don't have a home and I can't settle on living in one place? This sort of general indecisiveness in life.
And yes.
Yes. So I do think it's psychologically related to that. And yeah, I think endings are the most important part of a book. And I do want the middle of the book to be that sort of fun and games, like getting lost in the narrative, just allowing yourself to get lost in the woods. That's the fun part. But it only really is worth it if in the very end you hand the baton off to the reader in a really good place. I don't believe in a traditional ending. I think it's just that moment where you break away from the narrative and the author hands the baton over to the reader to sort of create their own, to just continue the narrative from there. So it's it's hard. It's something that you just have to arrive at intuitively, something that feels right. It's not in the rational brain that moment.
Do you discuss your the issues that you've had with your hands over the years? The tendonitis. Even earlier, as a kid, you had that giant lump on your hands. Obviously, which hugely impacts what you do for a living. Do you feel that dealing with that in its own way has to make you more deliberate with the kinds of drawings that you do and the amount of drawing that you do?
No, not necessarily. Because I've been dealing with hand stuff since I was a kid. And then certainly in my 20s when I was making blankets and Carnet de Voyage. Carnet de Voyage was like a travelogue book I did in 2004 where my crippling hand pains is a big focal point in that book. And it was at the time diagnosed as rheumatoid arthritis. I think I have both osteoarthritis and rheumatoid arthritis. I have this very common genetic condition, Dupuytren's contracture. Or the Viking disease. It just happens that I have like these all kind of compounding in a very aggressive, aggravated version of these conditions, which might be a combination of just bad genetics, overuse from drawing so much, quite likely from working in pesticides at a very young age, very, very heavy pesticides. And even like that sort of psychological component of, stress is bad for everyone. So if you, the things we worry about can kind of manifest in us. I think it's all of those things. There's something like really tied up spiritually, emotionally in my hands. And when I'm working on projects that are also accessing difficult, dark parts of my, psychological consciousness, I think it can hurt me physically.
If the actual act of making art causes you pain, that you have to be a little more choosy with the projects that you take, especially because it's I think I remember the doctor saying maybe this was degenerative to a certain extent too, that it's only going to get worse the longer you live.
Yeah, I'm hoping cybernetics will have progressed enough that I can get a cool Luke Skywalker hand. No, if I were wise, I would simplify my drawing style. And in fact, I don't. The more pain I'm in, the more I seem to lean into like a more time-intensive, hyper-detailed style. So, what I want to do is learn how to be more loose and, simple and gestural in my art again, which I feel like Blankets has. But instead, the more pain I'm in, the more I tend towards this obsessive, detailed style. So maybe there's a masochistic component to it. It's certainly like that Christian martyr sort of quality.
Exactly what I was going to say. I mean, so two things strike me. One, growing up and, working with your hands, hard labor, obviously, whatever difficulty that you have doing what you do for a living now, it's very different than actually being out in the field, but also that there is kind of a certain amount of suffering built into like Christianity specifically. That there is value in suffering for your life or your work or your art.
Yeah, that's definitely the way I was raised. I was raised by fundamentalist Christians who are also like working class, uneducated, stoic, long suffering. I mean, they identify as evangelicals, But it's from the Protestant sort of ethic, or even like you say, the original Christian church of martyrs and ascetics that were wanted to forsake society for something that was kind of minimal, but also based on suffering.
Early on, what was there a sense of guilt in that this is what you were doing for a living again versus like actually just backbreaking labor out in the field?
Oh yeah, there's a lot of that. So yeah, I mean, objectively growing up I didn't know any white collar people growing up. Everyone in my parents' circles were truck drivers and farmers and electricians. My dad's a plumber. So it was all of that physical sweat of the brow, backbreaking labor. So the fact that I get to just sit inside and like work at a desk already, I would feel guilt. Any kind of white collar job, I'm sure I would feel guilt about. Also growing up in this fundamentalist household, the arts were not celebrated. My parents were subscribers to this fundamentalist organization called the American Family Association, which had two main objectives, which were to shut down the ACLU and the National Endowment for the Arts. Speaking of contemporary politics, this is very deja vu of what's going on now. But it had this gross irony that my parents were poor, working class people that were donating money to this organization that was trying to, for instance, shut down this, the arts. and for the American Family Association, they would target everything from like The Simpsons to more high profile, controversial arts like Robert Mapplethorpe or Scorsese's Last Temptation of Christ. Those were the big targets of the American Family Association. And I got in trouble for what I drew all the time as a child. And there was this sort of understanding that if you're going to draw, you have to do it to praise Jesus and to bring people to Christ. You have to use this in a religious witnessing sort of way. And so anything that was done for more personal reasons, self-expression, I felt guilt about as a child.
It strikes me though that you kind of found a loophole there, in that your parents, they were just happy that you were reading something and didn't realize maybe the degree to which this was clearly rotting your brain.
Yeah, it was a fundamentalist household where media was censored. So we weren't allowed secular music, as they called it, in the house, only Christian music. All the TV and movies were like monitored, by our parents before we were allowed to watch it. And there's all kinds of like very mainstream things that everyone else I knew grew up with that I'm like, I never saw it as a kid because it wasn't allowed in the house. But comics were, just kids stuff, kids entertainment, and we bought it with our own money, with our ginseng earnings. So it passed under that censorship radar. So that was the medium that my brother and I were able to access the most, edgy storytelling and entertainment. So I do think that is a component of how it imprinted on me.
I suspect it imprinted on you in a profound way because that was all you had in terms of escape. And your brother kind of ended up in a similar position to you. He's not a cartoonist, but he is actually like quite a good artist. It's in the book too, and that clearly just having those comics like shaped both of your lives.
I wonder if my brother would agree with that, because he's not a comics enthusiast. But yes, he's a creative. He makes a living as a creative, and he's the much more successful sibling. He runs like a brand management company, so he found a way to make his creativity quite lucrative. When he was in high school, he took over a job I had as a low-end graphic designer at the local newspaper. And when he was a senior in high school, he was working full-time there while going to high school. He was like making more than our dad at that age, which is crazy. So he's been the most ambitious, hardworking, and financially successful one in the family. And he is a creative. He's always active creatively. These days, he's like really into electronic music. But comics was, he said, like, it's like, yeah, it was just something I was kind of pressured into by you, my older brother. It wasn't like a real active passion of mine.
Yeah, there is a funny moment where he's like, he gets into guns.
Yes, yeah, he had a big gun phase. But yeah, I was sort of using him to like get more comics than I could afford on my own. Like, I'm going to buy these comics. You buy these series so I can read those too. So the bossy older brother, 3 years older. And by the time we were in high school, we were individuating. And he was much more into like video games and technology, which weren't big interests of mine, and also into guns, which was never, ever an interest of mine.
What was your first reaction upon realizing that, you know, this house and this family that you grew up in, who only really had the Bible around, suddenly had a small bookshelf devoted to your work?
Well, I mean, it's very sweet. And yeah, I mean, over the years, my parents have become very supportive of my career. And when it started with Junkie Rice, they didn't have any interest, and with blankets, they felt full on insulted. It created a real rift between my parents and I for at least 5 years, I would say. You know, where I felt like they were actively injured by that book, and that too also inflamed my guilt. Like, oh, I did this thing, and it really hurt my family, and I had a lot of regret around that. But over the years, they've become more and more acceptant, and so I feel very moved by that. Part of the reason I think is that over the years, nobody has like approached them and said, "You were bad parents." You know, I don't think that is the experience the reader has of blankets. I think they realize that, like, you know, all child-parent dynamics have these awkward components.
It's not just your books, but they also they had blankets on the shelf, which again must have been, you know, a really profound moment for you.
Yeah, they came to accept it. You know, Habibi is the one that surprised me the most. Habibi came out in 2011, and it was the first book that I ever made that my parents liked. And they responded positively towards. And they're like, you know, it's really interesting that, like, we have so much in common with Muslims and with Islam. And I was like, wow, if like working class fundamentalist Christians can take that from that book, then it's succeeded, you know? Like, where they were able to humanize Muslim people and see their connections with that faith.
That's what I want, you know, reading this book about growing ginseng in the Midwest, that like that there is some connection there, that it, you know, that it does make people more worldly, or at least, you know, connect them in ways that they wouldn't have otherwise, and, you know, open their eyes and make them more progressive. But that's not a satisfaction that you can really give to the reader, because they never really made that connection themselves.
That's a good question. I mean, you know, like, I think the heart of the book is in the middle chapters 7 and 8, which is about the Hmong immigrant community in my hometown. And, you know, starting in the 1980s, there was just a trickle of Hmong refugees coming from Thailand and Laos. And there was a lot of racism towards them in my community. And then it's still in the 90s. In the 90s is when those immigrants were really kind of the bulk of the labor force in ginseng. And there was both microaggressions and macroaggressions towards the Hmong people in my homogenous white hometown. But now, 2025, when I go there, I do feel like a really kind of beautiful integration. It's a much more diverse community. I mean, the Hmong community especially is such a cornerstone of that area now. You know, I don't sense racism towards them. There's a huge Afghan refugee population now too, and even a growing Black community in the center of rural Wisconsin. But yes, in the 80s and 90s, I would not say that there was a lot of racism there. And for me, those two chapters are sort of kind of emotional heart of the book. But I really found it moving too when one of these old school white farmers that employed us as children, who was a Vietnam War vet, sort of overcame this racism he had associated with war trauma and his role as a soldier in America's war in Vietnam, and came to be like have really dear close friends that were Hmong. And just to clarify for the listener, because not everybody knows much about Hmong people. They were ethnic minority, one of many, many ethnic minorities in China that were kind of expelled during the Qing Dynasty, and resettled in Laos. And then during America's war in Vietnam, they aided the Americans. There's Geneva Accords that prohibited, Laos was a neutral territory. But the communists were kind of routing the Ho Chi Minh Trail through Laos. And so the American CIA went in and recruited a guerrilla army of tribal hills people in Laos to fight in place of Americans. And they were mostly Hmong people. And then when Americans pulled out of Vietnam in 1975, they just abandoned their allies, as they do in all these situations when we some 100,000 Hmong people were massacred, following that time. I mean, even now they say that there's still people being hunted down in Laos for their participation with the Americans in the 1970s. And so there was a huge influx of refugees, primarily in the 1990s. It took quite a while, almost 20 years, for them to get out of refugee camps in Thailand. And at this point, most of them have resettled in China, but then the second largest populations are in Minnesota and in Wisconsin in the world. And, in the 80s and 90s, these refugees were uneducated. Many of them didn't speak English, and so they worked in agriculture, and ginseng was our major agriculture. And the farmer that I talked to for those issues ended up becoming a very close friend of mine, Chua Vang. But he's just an amazing storyteller in his own right. He had this really compelling story to tell that was about his family. It was about being the child of an immigrant. It's about his whole dad's very epic refugee experience. And at the very beginning of the project, I might not have had the confidence that I was allowed to tell his story, because it wasn't my own, but that's sort of what was required of this project, because there's many voices related to this root.
How much of that kind of fear of, I guess, sort of telling other people's stories or, your point of view or privilege was, if at all, a result to sort of pushback that you might have gotten around Habibi when that came out?
A lot, so when Ginseng Roots, the series, was announced, it before anybody had even seen the first issue, just the idea of the book upset a lot of people, where they thought I was repeating the crime, quote unquote, crime of Habibi in cultural appropriation, where Habibi's talking about Islamic culture. Here he is doing it again with Chinese culture.
Yeah.
But they hadn't seen the book. They hadn't realized. This criticism didn't seem to follow the series after that initial announcement, because it's a different beast. This isn't a made up fantasy book. It's primarily memoir, and then the second part of it is documentary. So everybody that I interviewed is recorded. This isn't made up dialogue. It's meticulously transcribed, and then I would show those. All those pages to the interviewees for approval before it went to print. In fact, the first couple issues of the series, where I was interviewing White Farmer, I did not follow up. It wasn't until I got to the Chua issues, where I'm oh wait, this is a very sensitive territory. I have to make sure that Chua signs off on all this, that he's comfortable with every kind of depiction. And I got much better after that with every subsequent issue of okay, the people I interview, I want them to approve of what's in here and edit to whatever degree they need to what's in there. which is not always like a courtesy that's been, I mean, it's almost never been a courtesy provided to me by journalists. You do an interview and then you see things later and you're like, did I say that? Like, nobody showed that to me for my approval.
Was that something that you afforded your family, for example, when doing blankets?
Oh, no, not with blankets at all. Blankets was created in secret, at least from my parents. I mean, my siblings were very involved in the process. Interestingly, we didn't talk about it, but in blankets, my sister doesn't exist. I did not include her in that story, but she was a big part of the writing process of that story. And she was totally comfortable, at least she claims, with not being in the book. It gave her less to worry about. And working on that book it created an intimacy with my siblings that I didn't have prior, because we didn't have a really communicative family. But working on that book really pushed me to ask my siblings very intimate questions about our shared childhood, their faith, their sexuality, all these things. And then Ginseng Roots continued on that trajectory. Only with this book, I did include my parents. I didn't want to end up in the same situation. And with the first issue, they were very happy and excited and proud of Ginseng Roots. Second issue, their participation started to diminish, because the second issue focuses a lot on my family directly. And my parents were hoping it would be more broadly a book about farming and not about family. And so there was some awkward growing pains throughout the process. But by the time I got to the final issue, which again very much focuses directly on my family, they signed off on it, And there'd be things that they contested. My mom would be like, well, I never said that, even though I had it recorded. And even though my siblings were like, yeah, she said that like 100 times. So it is interesting that the things we say, we don't always remember, or we remember them differently. But ultimately, especially with my mom, she's like, no, it's your book. Do whatever you want with it. Our memories are different,
To a certain extent, maybe this is inevitable, but if you write multiple memoirs in your life, that they're going to end up circling around on each other. So, some of the book is about your family's reaction to the earlier book.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a meta narrative in there, and I'm trying to correct, some of the flaws of blankets. Or I don't know if flaws is the word, but for instance, the omission of my sister is a pretty massive one. And so I'm addressing that, like I did not write my sister into blankets. Here's why. But I don't think I can continue to get away with that, because if I'm going to talk about my family, I mean, as is, I mean, my sister has a daughter, so I have a niece who was in much of these scenes and interviews throughout the book, but I don't include my niece in the book. So there's always omissions that are happening to get to the core of the story. And then, yes, also the dialogue in Blankets is my own fictionalized, reconstructed from my own memory dialogue, where this was a more meticulous documentary approach where I was recording and transcribing the dialogue. And I rarely allowed myself the indulgence of just making up a line or two.